I want to start by apologizing. I have a 2-year-old who's in a different room in the house with my husband, but if it gets loud, it's not like I can really stop the video every time. So just I want to apologize about that in advance. So this first question, I know it's a rectangle. We're looking at the largest scientific building and the perimeter, so the distance all the way around all four sides is going to be 2468. So it's going to just be feet. It's not area, it's not a squared kind of measurement, but it's basically going to be each of the four sides added together have to add up to 2468. There are a couple ways of approaching this. You can use the equation. You can say, okay, well, 2 times the length plus 2 times the width is going to be equal to 2468. And if that way makes sense to you, that's great. I also want to kind of walk you through how to do it without the equation. And that is, I know that I have two of the sides. I have 518, and if it's 518 on one side, the opposite side will also be 518 because it's a rectangle. So I have 518 plus 518. And of course, my calculator is going to die again, so let me go ahead and just freeze that out a minute. But I'm going to add 518 and 518 to get basically what those two sides are. So I'll just do it by hand for now. And that's going to be 1036. So that's really two of the sides. So I'm going to have 2468, and I'm taking away the distance for two of the sides, so 1036, which means I end up having 1432. And that's for these two remaining sides. So I know that this side right here plus this side right here have to add up to 1432, which means really half of 1432 is here and the other half is there. So half of 1432 is 716. So that missing side is 716. So what are my dimensions? 716 feet by 518. And so there's really two different dimensions there. Make sure you include both of them. They gave us one, but they want to know the dimensions, and the dimensions are actually two numbers. And you could get the same thing by using this equation, but I wanted to kind of draw the picture and kind of walk you through without the equation. So this next one is the clock. It is talking about the minute hand. So the minute hand is from the middle going out, and it says the minute hand is 8 centimeters. So another way of looking at this is it's really the radius. Remember, the radius is half of that circle, where the diameter is the whole way. Now, because it's the radius, I'm going to kind of make sure I keep thinking of that. And I'm going to write radius, or r, equals 8, just to kind of keep that straight. So there's really two parts of this question. So always make sure you read the question all the way through so you don't just do half of it. But it says, first of all, how far does a tip of the hand, so this outside edge right here, move in 1 hour? Well, it goes all the way around the circle, which means I'm really finding the circumference, because the circumference is the perimeter of a circle. There's two equations here for circumference. I'm picking this one because it's the one that has a radius. So I'm going to say, okay, it's going to be 2 times 3.14 times the radius, which is 8. So I'll pull up that calculator, which is hopefully working. Or it should be in a second. And I would say 2 times 3.14 times 8. And that gives us 50.24. Now, so I write 50.24, but then I've got to look really carefully, because it does say here, give your answer to the nearest tenth of a centimeter. So please pay attention to those little directions, which means tenth is one place. So I'm going to say 50.2, because with the 4, I don't round it up. And this is the distance around, so it's one dimensional, so it's just centimeters. So the first answer is 50.2 centimeters. The second question is the area. Well, the area equation is area equals pi r squared. So I would say pi is 3.14. The radius is still 8. And we're just going to square it. So I'll take out my calculator again and say 3.14 times 8 squared, which gives me 200.96. Well, once again, I want to round one place past the decimal. That 9 rounds up, so this is where it gets a little bit tricky. If I have 200.96, this tells me to round this up to the next number. Well, 9 rounded up 1 is going to be a 10, which makes it go into 201.0. And yes, that 0 becomes important because it's not just 1. We actually knew that it was that specific. So you want to include that 0, and it's telling you to go to one place past the 10. So please actually write 201.0. So whenever they tell you to round to the nearest tenth, and you have that information, now would I mark you wrong if you said 201? No. If you said 50.24, that is a little bit different because you're not even rounding. If you forgot the 0 here, I would not mark you wrong. So in theory, the correct answer is 201.0 centimeters squared. And please include that squared sign because it's area. Anytime it's area, it gets squared. So this one, I drew the picture, but it's a rectangular window with a triangle on top of the rectangle. So the width of the window is 3 feet and the height is 4 feet. And the height of the triangle part is 2 feet. So I just been putting the numbers in. I definitely recommend drawing the picture like I did and then putting those numbers in because without that it gets tricky. So we're trying to figure out the area. So there's really once again two shapes. There's a triangle and a rectangle. To figure out the area of a rectangle, it's base times width. So I can say, oh, 4 times 3, that's 12. That one's the easy one. The triangle gets a little trickier. So the area of a triangle equals 1/2 base times height. So I'm going to say it's going to be 1/2, or I could say 0.5, either one. The base is this bottom. Now we don't have anything on our shape for that, but I know that this is 3, it has to be 3 up here because this line right here and this line right here have to be the same. So it's going to be 1/2 times 3, and then they told us the height, which is 2. Well, 3 times 2 is 6. 6 cut in half is going to be 3. So the area of this section is going to be 3. So I have a 12 for the rectangle, a 3 for the triangle. 12 plus 3 is 15. So I'm going to say it's going to be 15 feet squared because area is squared. And so it's feet because they tell us it's in feet and it's feet squared. So I get 12 here. I have 3 here because just to clarify, because this one's usually easier. The base is 3, the height is 2, and we're taking half of that. Most common mistake in that question is to forget to take half of your triangle. So make sure that you're really looking at those equations on your formula sheet and remember that triangle is half. Okay, so now we have a rectangle. So I drew the rectangle already. It's 84 feet long, 13 feet wide. We want to find its area and the length of its diagonal. So I'll draw the diagonal in. First, let's figure out the area. So the area of a rectangle is just base times height. So it's going to be 84 times 13, which if we pull out our calculator, 84 times 13 is 1,092. Sorry. And it is feet, so it's going to be feet squared. So that's that first answer. Now the second one, they want us to find the diagonal. Now the thing to recognize about a rectangle is when I find the diagonal, I have really 2 right triangles. And this basically, that symbol means that it's a 90-degree angle, which makes it a right triangle. So whenever we have 2 sides of a right triangle and we're trying to find that third side, we're going to use that Pythagorean theorem. So a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Well, I can say 13 squared plus 84 squared equals c squared. It doesn't matter, remember, which one comes first, the 13 or the 84. They're both the legs, so either one could be a, either one could be b. But that diagonal, that one that's across from that right angle, that's always your c. So I'm going to just use my calculator here a second and say 13 squared plus 84 squared, just to figure out what that side is. And it's 7,225. And that equals c squared. Now I want to take the square root of that because I'm trying to basically kind of finish the question. I don't want c squared, I want just c. So if I want just c, that equals the square root of 7,225. And if I go to my calculator, the square root of 7,225 is 85. And notice they didn't tell me to round to anything because they knew it was going to be just a nice, neat number. Now this is just one line. It's not the area or anything, so it's just 85 feet. It's not feet squared or feet cubed because it's a one-dimensional distance. So the reason I knew to use the Pythagorean theorem is because I use that whenever I have two sides of a right triangle and I'm looking for the third. And so it's just a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And then a and b don't really matter, but c has to be the one that's not touching that right angle. They never touch. Okay, so here's another one with the formula sheet. It says a total surface area. So I know I'm looking at surface area of a rectangular box. So I used my sheet. I found the rectangular box, ignoring the volume because I'm just looking for surface area. So I'm going to recopy this and say, okay, so surface area is equals to 2 length times width plus 2 length times height plus 2 width times height. Really what you're doing is you're finding the area of each side and you're doubling it, because if you've got a front, you've got a back. If you've got a right side, you've got a left side. It doesn't matter if you get the order right because the same things end up happening. But let's start with length. I'm going to just label them over here to make it easier. It says the length is 5. The width is 2. And the height, the width is 3, sorry, it's 3 feet wide. The way it's phrased is tricky for me for some reason. So 3 feet wide, 5 feet long, and the height is 2. Even if I mix up the order, as long as I have all three numbers, it doesn't really matter because with a box you can just turn it and the sides change. But so length times width. So that's length times width is 5 times 3, that's 15. Let's just go ahead and just put those numbers in. So it's going to be 2 times 15. And then length times height, well 5 times 2 is 10. So it's going to be 2 times 10. And then width times height is 3 times 2, so it's going to be 2 times 6. So all I really did is I found the area. In the front there, I have the length times the height. So that's going to be this little box right here. The front part is going to be 10. And so as long as you find all three areas, you're set. So 2 times 15 is 30. 2 times 10 is 20. And 2 times 6 is 12. So you have 62 feet. And now it's surface area, so it's going to be squared. So here's my equation. I just put the numbers in and said, okay, well, length times width is 15. And that's all I did in that first step, and then I solved it. Some of you may just look at the drawing and say, I'm just going to find all three sides and then double them. That's fine, but this is just a good way to double check that you have all the spots that you need. So the key thing is that you end up with 62 square feet. So then we have the volume of a circular cylinder. So I found the cylinder and I want the volume. So I'm looking at pi r squared h. Well, pi is 3.14. Now I'm looking at this. It says radius is 5. So it's 5 squared. The height is 9. Well, at this point, it gets to be just as easy as typing it in. Once I write the equation down, I type in 3.14 times 5 squared times 9. And it's 706.5. Now, with these, I'd recommend either typing it in twice or at least looking over and saying, does this look like this? So I've got my 3.14, my 5 squared times 9. So 706.5. And I do like to double check just to make sure. So I have inches, and it's volume, so it's to the third power. They don't say anything about rounding. So if they don't say anything about rounding, however you round is fine. The only time I will grade you on rounding is if they tell you, like in that previous question, to round to the nearest tenth, and you don't do that. So make sure you read for when they tell you. If they don't tell you, it doesn't matter. The good news is I know that pretty much everyone hated the geometry section, and that's over. So there's not that much geometry. There's a good mix. So now we get into some of the finance stuff. So, a jewelry store is selling rings at a 20% discount. The original price of a ring is $450. What's the amount of the discount? Well, we're saying what is 20% of 450, which is times. So we just take out a calculator and type in 20% times 450. So I get 90. So after the discount, if you have 450 minus 90, I end up with 360 if you subtract those two. So this is my new price. Now, if the sales tax was 5%, what's the final cost after the discount and including the sales tax? So I'm going to take my after the discount price and I'm going to times it by 6% to find out what my tax would be. So 360 times 6%, and I get $21.60. And remember, whenever you're dealing with money, you must always round to the nearest penny unless you're told otherwise. And you will be graded off if you don't. So if you just said $22, that's not right because it's a different amount. You don't want to sort of start charging you more just because they can round. So then I have my 360. I have my 2160. If I add those together to get my new price, I get $381.60. So really the goal is figure out what the discount is. So it's 20% of 450, and of means times. So 20% times 450. That gave me 90. Well, if I have $90 off, I say 450 minus the 90, and that gives me the 360. And then I times that by 6% to get my tax, keep the nearest penny, and then just add those two together. Okay, simple interest. Simple interest is always interest equals principal times the rate times the time. Remember, time is always in years. So in this case, the principal is $2,500. My rate is 8%, and my time is 12 years. Now, some of you may have written it like this, 2,500 times 0.08 times 12. Those are exactly the same. Does not matter which one you use. They both basically mean 8%. So 2,500 times 8% times 12 years gives me 2,400. So that's the interest that you're going to get after 12 years, which is actually almost doubling, which is really good. So I'd say 2,400. Now, to find out how much money was in the whole account, you would add those together. So you actually have more than 2,400. In case you're thinking that doesn't make sense, it's just that's how much money you earned. That's actually the interest. That's different than when we figure out compound interest because we're looking for the total amount. That's what the equation's for. This one is just giving you interest. So I've had people before say, this doesn't make sense because it's less than I started with. I lost money. No, you still had the 2,500. This is in addition to it. It's just the interest. And the reason I say it is because this equation, the compound interest, tells you the total amount that's in there. So they're just written differently. So I wanted to kind of point that out. With question 9, please show me your work on the quiz so that if you type it in wrong, but you have all the right work, I'm more concerned with you setting it up correctly. So please write it down so I can double check that. So I have the 15,000 that's invested. So that's my principal. My parentheses, 1 plus, my rate is 4%. It's compounded monthly. That means it's compounded 12 times per year. And this bottom number, that's always one of the confusing ones, how many times a year do you get interest? Now the exponent is how many times, like in all do you get interest. So it's 12 times a year for 5 years, which means it's going to be 60. So you get 60. So that's where that 60 comes from. It's 12 times a year times the number of years. That's 60. Write this out because if you happen to get it wrong in your calculator, this will give you the majority of the credit. Please don't do part of it and then do the next part, type the whole thing in, because it eliminates all those little rounding things that happen, which don't seem like a big deal, but can actually change your answer completely. And we have 4% over 12. And then I go to the 60th power. So it's going to be a fair amount. So 1831, and I round to the nearest penny. You have to round to the nearest penny. I know that was an issue yesterday. 1831 and 49 cents. So please watch that rounding. Money is always to the nearest cent unless they tell you differently, which they didn't here. So the key thing with question 9, a couple key things. Write it out. The bottom number in that fraction, it tells you right here, is the number of compounding periods per year. Monthly would be 12. And this number right here is how many times a year times the number of years. Really, it's the total number of times you're going to get paid interest over the loan. Okay, the last question deals with this chart. This chart is in your formula sheet, so make sure you have your formula sheets next week. But we have a mortgage loan at 9.5% for 25 years. So 9.5. I grab my highlighter for this. So 9.5, I can kind of follow that across. And then 25 years going down. So they meet at 8.74. So that 8.74 that comes from the table, that's per thousand. If you forget, it says it there. So now I look at the amount. It's 175,000. So I say times 175. So 8.74 times is at 175 is 1529.50. So that's the amount of your mortgage just for the actual house. Doesn't include the taxes and the insurance. So here we're looking at definitely a more expensive mortgage, primarily because it's a terrible interest rate. It's not so realistic nowadays. Now taxes are $2,100 a year. So I'm going to say, okay, that's, whoops, let me get my pointer back. So 2,100 divided by 12, because it's annually, so I want to see how much it is per month. So it's $175. And that's for taxes. And then the insurance is $175 per year. And so once again, we're going to divide that by 12. We end up dividing both of those by 12. So I want the monthly. And that's $14.58. So don't round to $15. Don't make yourself pay more than you have to. So it's $14.58. And that's your insurance. So I could use my calculator, or I can just add this way. So 8, 10, carry the 1, which makes us 10, 19. So 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 7, and then 1. So your total payment for your taxes, your insurance, and your mortgage is going to be a little over $1,700. So definitely a pricey home to be in. And that's the last question. So we will start on Thursday with probably about just 10 minutes to ask a last minute question. But because you have this resource, we're not going to spend more than 10 minutes on that. Because on Thursday we'll also have the quiz, questions on the homework, and then also there is some new material. Not a ton, but there are some new things to cover. So I want to make sure we have time to do that. So that's pretty much all of this. Hopefully this was helpful.